Welcome to Current Affairs on JTV. Today I'm joined by the author and commentator Douglas Murray, who's Associate Director of the Henry Jackson Society and the contributing editor to The Spectator. Douglas, thank you for joining me. It's no secret that Europe is currently facing an immigration crisis, but this isn't the first immigration crisis Europe has faced. What, in your view, makes this different to other ones?
What makes it different is several things. One is scale, and the other is the identity question. The scale problem is probably best understood if one considers that it's true all countries in Europe have had immigration of some kind for a long time. That said, the populations in Europe have actually been very static for a long time. Britain has been a fairly static population for about a millennia. So the speed of what is happening now is one of the most striking things. Take one very brief example of what was everyday migration until quite recently. 50,000 Huguenots came into the country after 1683 into the UK over a period of some years. By the late 1990s, 50,000 people was about 6 weeks of average immigration into the UK. So the scale is far faster than it's been before, and that was before this recent so-called crisis. The speed now is unprecedented. Germany taking in 1% of its population every year, actually a bit more than 1%, more than 1 million people this year. So that's the first thing, is the speed, and the second question is the identity question. Immigration is made a lot easier and more easy to be dealt with and coped with by a society if the people coming are pretty much similar to the society they're going into. So French Huguenots, French Protestants, was not very difficult to assimilate into British society. That said, it took a few centuries to be sort of completely assimilated. What's so different about what's happening at the moment is people coming in who have really no connection to the society they're going into.
Okay, but if I stop you on that point, but there's always been a reaction to outsiders coming in. Give an example of Jewish immigration in the UK, say. The response to that, a vast wave at the end of the 19th century, was the Aliens Act, an attempt to curtail this. Isn't this just the same thing?
No, I mean, it's something I think a lot of Jewish people are very nervous about, the immigration questions, precisely because they think, but aren't we immigrants? Isn't this going to come back on us in some way? I think this is a great mistake for a number of reasons. One, as I say again, is that issue of speed and the numbers, which is what's so crippling across Europe at the moment and threatens to become so very dangerous across Europe. But that second thing is the identity question. Jews coming into Britain in the late 19th century were very similar to their host society compared to, for instance, somebody from Eritrea arriving in Germany, a country, a culture from which they have almost nothing in common, and this is the reason I cite these two things, the numbers and the identity question, is because these are two things which people have been very, very unwilling to consider in recent years, but they will have to consider them. And you can see that, by the way, just one very quick example, you can see that by the fact that after allowing in roughly 1.2 million immigrants this year into Germany, after having already done that, Chancellor Merkel's government then realizes there might be, let's say, an anti-Semitism problem among some of their new arrivals. So suddenly a German minister says, we don't want anyone who has anti-Semitic views coming into Germany. I mean, it's true that historically Germany, it would be a great irony if Germany were post-war, having sort of cleansed itself of its guilt in some way, then decided to partly try to allay that guilt by importing as many anti-Semites as they could from the most anti-Semitic region in the world. But it's too late. You've imported them. You can't question them then. You can't find out if they're anti-Semites. But you can bet that a lot of them are.
I'll split those up in a second, but let's start with the first of those, the numbers question. Isn't it true that part of the issue is that Europe requires immigration in order for our economies to continue turning the way we've become used to?
This is one of the great myths, the source of which I can never quite identify. Or at least I can identify the source, I can't identify why it has such popular appeal. there's this idea, the UN perpetuates it and the EU perpetuates it, that, for instance, Germany is an aging population and they're a greying population, they often say.
But they are.
And that, well, this assumes, among other things, that countries should always enlarge their population base. You should get bigger and bigger. This is not historically always the case. If you have an aging population, it doesn't necessarily mean that means you have to produce far more children. You have challenges, certainly, but it doesn't necessarily mean you need a vastly larger population. And I would have thought the most idiotic thing in the world is to decide that we as Germans are greying and that we need more young people in our country to work, so we will import them from an entirely different culture. We will bring in an entirely different culture to become the next generation. I mean, anyone who doesn't foresee problems in that can't have their eyes open. But the other crucial thing about this is this: nobody can explain at the EU level or anywhere else at the level of people who have been perpetuating and encouraging this level of migration, can explain how it is possible to simultaneously, or to argue that Europe needs these people as it were, a labour force, when they are entering largely through countries in the south of Europe which all have between 25 and 50% youth unemployment. How is it possible that people can be arriving in their hundreds of thousands through Greece when Greek youth unemployment is so high? Arriving in Italy when Italian youth unemployment is so high? How is it possible that people can seriously think this is a good model? You import people to be the working force into countries which already don't have jobs for the young. And if the EU meant anything, if it were a real thing, which had really good intentions towards Europe as a whole, I would think the obvious thing would be, first of all, if there is a labour shortage in Germany, plug it with people from the south of Europe, plug it with fellow EU citizens, plug it with people from Greece or from Italy or from Portugal. Goodness knows, people who need jobs. But I would do that long before I decided I would import 1 million Eritreans.
Okay, so I get that on economic migration you're happy to, if you like, put up quotas and instead move Europeans internally. But what about asylum seekers? What about people fleeing from war zones?
Well, I think that asylum is a very important thing to have as something you can give as a society. It's a humanitarian necessity on occasion. And I think it's very important that people don't mix these things up. In my observation, and having travelled to some of the points of entry that migrants are coming into, most of the migrants coming into Europe and who have been coming in the last few years are not asylum seekers. They are not asylum seekers. The majority are not from Syria. The majority are from sub-Saharan Africa, from across other parts of the Middle East. Many of them are from the Balkans, going into Germany. Very, very large number are from the Balkans. Moving across Europe and taking advantage of this opportunity. People are coming from as far away as Bangladesh. This is because at this fateful moment last year, Chancellor Merkel basically said the doors of Germany are open and everybody who wanted to go could go in. So it's a great mistake to think that the immigration crisis now confronting Europe is a crisis which we can't do anything about because we owe it to the Syrian people to give them asylum. As I say, re-stress, most of the people coming are not Syrians. They are not fleeing war.
Okay, let's leave the numbers debate for one moment. We are where that is right now. Integration is obviously the other part of what you suggested. And you mentioned some problems, for example, anti-Semitism coming in with some immigrants, other things that we've obviously seen recently in Cologne, other places, attitudes being brought in. How do we integrate people on this scale in our societies? Because as you said, if we fail, then we fail completely.
Yes, I mean, we should start from the premise that it may not be possible. It may be too late, it may not be possible. We may be facing a future of unbelievable strife across our continent that changes it entirely and changes attitudes entirely. That is possible. And I say that simply because the political answer is always we must make this work or this will work and so on. And actually, when you make such profound changes to a society, it's possible that you will destroy your society. Now, most of the migrants coming to Europe in recent years are of Muslim background. And we know that the Muslim world is the only part of the world since the Second World War where anti-Semitism is tolerated and indeed encouraged, taught. And we know this even in Britain. Britain and its Muslim communities, which have been here for some decades now, themselves have a very serious anti-Semitism problem. We know that, apart from anything else, because somebody who is not a friend of mine, but a very left-wing, very fanatical Muslim journalist called Mehdi Hassan, wrote a piece for the New Statesman, no less, a couple of years ago, in which he said that we Muslims must face up to the fact that anti-Semitism in our community is, I think he said, rife, commonplace, and he said every Muslim reader will know what I'm talking about. He said it's our dirty little secret as a community. Behind closed doors, it's always the Jews. It's the Jews who did everything. It's the Jews who do 9/11, it's the Jews who did 7/7, it's the Jews who did everything. That's among people who have been in Britain for decades.
Okay, so how do we get over this quickly? Because
you may not be able to. We may not be able to. I wouldn't have thought France will be able to. I can't see any particular long-term future for Jews in France. Country by country, there will be some countries that do stand up to this. There will be some countries, when Muslim anti-Semitism grows, say it isn't the Jews who should leave, but the people who would make the Jews leave. There are some countries where that may happen, but other countries where it'll fail. It's a numbers game. It's a numbers game. Every single day in Malmö in Sweden, 1,000 new Muslim arrivals come in to Malmö. The remaining Jewish community in Malmö is now under 1,000. It's a numbers game. The Swedish Jews can't survive there because they're going to be outnumbered too much. Maybe at some point in the 24th century, all of these new arrivals will realize they shouldn't be blaming the Jews for everything and that they've got some problems they should answer themselves. But until then, maybe we're just going to go through a terrible period of strife.
But the fact that some Muslims recognize this is surely a positive sign.
Yeah, but it's ones. That's the problem. I mean, the people who are willing to admit to the problem are tiny in number. And there isn't much of a desire to do anything about it. There's no particular propulsion to do something about it. And in the meantime, it should also be said, is that the so-called interfaith outreach work, which the Jewish community, among others, does a lot of, places a lot of hope in, achieves almost nothing. A couple of old bearded men get together and agree on some dietary thing they've got in common. But it doesn't solve the fact that anti-Semitism mainly comes from the Muslim community these days. It doesn't solve the problem, the fact that that's taught in many mosques and many Muslim schools. And it doesn't address the fact that now, if you go to, if Israel does anything anywhere in the world, anywhere in its region, there will immediately be a protest of very angry young Muslims in the centre of London and other British cities. You can have an old rabbi and an old mullah sitting around having tea, agreeing on dietary stuff, but that doesn't solve why the hatred is being taught. And that's something the rabbis and the Jewish leadership in this country, among other places, just don't want to admit to. Perhaps it's too bad to confront.
Douglas Murray, I hope you're wrong, but that's all we have time for today. Thank you very much for joining me.